Scary. Scary?
Pissed.
Big Bad.
Directed and co-written by O.P. Cooper. We are talking Big Bad from 2016. Now this is a creature in the woods type movie. I can't tell you exactly what type of creature it is because it's kind of a little plot point in the movie. But effectively the story focuses on three kind of teenagers that are doing a sort of sponsored stay in a kind of disused kind of jailhouse for raising funds for the school. So these three students are meant to be staying in this sort of old, rundown, you know, old style kind of jailhouse that hasn't been used for, you know, a long time. And they are kind of accompanied by their teacher. But when they are there, they are seen to be attacked by some type of feral creature that's come out of the woods. And initially our three students are sort of locked in their cells, and what can they do? But it's kind of an old, you know, prison, it's sort of rotting and things like this, so we end up having a kind of chase through the woods. We meet a variety of other kind of characters, and the final confrontation with this mysterious creature, and we find out what it might be. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. Now this is a lighter tone. In actual fact, I would say this movie feels a little bit like a kind of Goosebumps style, kind of more family orientated movie. There's one gore shot in it towards the end, but for the most part it feels like more of a family orientated movie. So I think, maybe with the exception of the one sort of gory shot, which is, you know, right at the end of the movie, ultimately the last sort of action shot of the film, I guess you would say, it's actually relatively tame. Now that might be a good thing and a bad thing, and we will talk about it in the negatives, but I do think it kind of makes for a sort of lighter tone, a sort of more fun, spirited adventure, so to speak, with kind of horror overtones, and possibly, yes, a movie that is suitable for slightly younger audiences. There's not really any sort of swearing or sex, anything like that. It's all a little bit sort of, you know, made for that younger audience, I would suggest. But it still has an element of danger in it, because this creature is treated relatively sort of seriously, and it does seem to be quite vicious. Even though the movie doesn't really show you anything particularly sort of graphic on screen, I will say I kind of quite like the way this creature is sort of misinterpreted in regards to what it actually is. They think it might be one thing, but it, you know, it may well be something else. But they're maybe sort of somewhat easily mistaken to a certain degree, and I kind of quite like that. I also really quite like the way these teenagers are actually relatively quick thinking. You know, there's a couple of things that they do, and decisions that they make seem relatively smart, even down to some quite small things. For example, this creature, these three cells are all kind of next to each other, and it's attacking one cell, but because of the way this jail is sort of set up, you can't really see, because obviously you're all trapped in a cell. So, you know, one of these kids is using his phone to kind of like look around the corner and things like this. So there's some elements like that I think just, you know, small little things that I just think add up to characters being like relatively smart in the movie. Even though the movie's not trying to be a particularly sort of serious movie, you still felt these characters didn't seem like idiots to a degree. And I will say, I think the performances, they're tonally pretty good. And like I said, this movie has a sort of a lighter tone, but the characters all feel quite likeable, quite sort of unique and personable as well. So I think this is a film where you can kind of sort of root for the characters. I mean, it doesn't overpopulate them. And again, this may have a negative, but, you know, I will say that our trio of students that it really focuses on, you kind of quite like them all, and you've got a good sense of who they are. And there's some comedic moments that are relatively fun without being an out-and-out sort of comedy. The movie's actually kind of quite well paced, really outstay its welcome. It gets its point across, and it's not too long before we start getting the attacks and things. And I think the setup's actually kind of quite fun and almost a little bit kind of unique. The movie actually is relatively well filmed as well. I will say there's some quite nice shots here. The movie isn't trying to be anything sort of masterful in regards to cinematography or anything, but nonetheless, I do think the movie is actually relatively well shot. What doesn't work, the tone is a double-edged sword. Now, as much as I would say, yes, this is actually quite a good movie for younger audiences, if you are a more ardent horror fan, or maybe wanting more of a visceral horror experience, this maybe is where this movie may be disappointing, because it does aim at a younger audience, or at least how it feels. The distinct lack of kind of gore, apart from, as I say, one scene, and even then it's not especially gory, and just kind of the lack of more the adult sort of tone, you know, as I say, it doesn't really have much in the way of even swearing and things, and as such it feels somewhat sort of sanitised. It also isn't helped by this kind of peppy, upbeat soundtrack that this movie has. I'm not saying this movie is necessarily bad, but it is this kind of light, sort of ditty music that kind of goes along, and again, it really deflates any sense of actual kind of danger or tension. So there is that. Now the movie has this plot point where we're not quite actually sure what the creature is, and our kids mistake it for one thing when in actual fact it could be something else. But I will say, I have to say, for me, it actually looks more like what they initially think it is, I have to say. So when we do find out what it is, I think maybe it's not the best depiction of this type of creature. That's all I'll sort of say on that. I do think this movie actually could have had a little bit of more gravitas had they expanded the cast a little bit. Maybe gone for 5 or 6 students, because the movie doesn't really give us any victims, to be honest. There is a couple of people that end up biting a bullet, but it's all off screen. And I think it would have been a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more interesting if we had some actual kind of victims that we got to know, because the characters that end up maybe getting killed by this creature, that they have a limited amount of screen time. It's all off screen. You don't really care. And I think had it been some of the students, and we kind of had a little bit of time to get to know a few more students, it may have been a little bit more impactful. But that's not what we got. So there's that. I think as the film goes on, it sort of doesn't quite know what to do with the plot, I have to say. I think the setup is relatively strong, but once we're kind of running around in the woods, you feel like the plot really sort of stops at that point, and it is at that point just kind of like kids getting chased around the woods by a monster, and then it doesn't really do anything else interesting with the story. Whilst I think the setup of having these kids kind of voluntarily kind of set going in this old jailhouse and kind of getting locked in themselves, quite an interesting setup. But that whole premise of these kids being locked in these cells is sort of dealt with quite quickly, and I thought that was kind of somewhat of a unique element to this movie. So, I think the movie has some good elements, but it's sort of tonally it's a little bit not quite sure who this movie's made for, because it doesn't really feel like it's a kids movie exactly. It just tonally and as I say, its level of maturity seems like younger, but it doesn't really feel like it's playing to be a kids movie. And also I think there's some missed opportunities in regards to some of the kind of the plot elements and things like that. Overall, I have to say I still relatively enjoyed this movie, although I do think it's a movie that is a little flawed. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10 though, because I did quite enjoy it. I was somewhat engaged in it. So it wasn't a bad movie, I will say. In actual fact, it relatively a little bit above average, one might say. Have you seen it? Please let me know your thoughts, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.